The small bell above the diner door jingled as another customer stepped in from the cold. The young waitress looked up from wiping down the counter, tucking a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear before grabbing a menu. This was her life, 6 days a week, sometimes 12 hours a day at the Bluebird Diner in downtown Portland. Regular customers knew her as May, the quiet, dependable waitress who never forgot a coffee preference or special order. "Morning, May. The usual, please," called out an elderly man settling into his regular booth by the window. He didn't need to elaborate. May already had his order memorized. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with a side of strawberry jam, and a small orange juice. "Coming right up." "Mr. Robert," she replied with a genuine smile that reached her tired eyes. She scribbled the familiar order on her notepad, though she didn't really need to. Her memory for customer preferences was something her boss Frank often praised her for. The Bluebird wasn't fancy by any means. The blue vinyl booths had seen better days, and the black and white checkerboard floor tiles were scuffed from decades of foot traffic. But the food was honest, the prices fair, and the atmosphere warm. For the 5 years since she'd moved to Portland, this place had been May's financial lifeline. What? Her customers and co-workers didn't know. What nobody in this part of her life knew was that May harbored a secret passion that had nothing to do with memorizing orders or balancing plates of pancakes and bacon. "Order up." The cook's voice snapped her back to the present moment. May efficiently distributed plates to their respective tables, refilled coffee cups, and cleared away empty dishes. Her movements were quick but graceful, almost rhythmic, as if she were following music only she could hear. The lunch rush kept her too busy for daydreaming. Between the business people on their lunch breaks and the regular crowd of retirees who came for the daily special, May barely had time to catch her breath. By mid-afternoon, when the diner finally quieted down, she slumped onto a stool at the counter, massaging her aching feet. "You look beat," Frank commented, sliding a glass of water toward her. Though gruff on the outside, he had a soft spot for his employees, especially May, who never complained despite taking on extra shifts whenever someone called out sick. "Just the usual Tuesday," she replied, rolling her shoulders to work out the tension. "I'm fine. You know, you've been picking up shifts for 3 years straight. Ever think about taking a real break? Do something fun for once?" May gave a small, non-committal shrug. "Bills don't pay themselves." Frank frowned but didn't push further. He knew bits and pieces of her story, that she had come to the States with big dreams, that family obligations back home consumed much of what she earned. What he didn't know was that May's exhaustion stemmed not just from her long hours at the diner, but from how she spent her nights after work. The remainder of her shift passed in the usual blur of orders, conversations, and cleanup. By 8 o'clock, May hung up her apron, collected her modest tips, and waved goodbye to the evening staff. The walk to her apartment took exactly 17 minutes. She'd timed it countless times, mentally composing music with each step. Her apartment building was old and unremarkable. Sandwiched between a laundromat and a convenience store, the stairwell smelled perpetually of cooking oil and cleaning products, but May barely noticed anymore. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, her tired legs protesting each step until she reached her door, 3B, with its peeling paint and temperamental lock. Inside, the space was small but meticulously organized. A futon that doubled as her bed, a tiny kitchen area, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in, and a small table with 2 mismatched chairs. But dominating the modest living space was the one luxury May had allowed herself, an old upright piano that took up nearly an entire wall. The instrument wasn't beautiful by conventional standards. The dark wood was scratched in places and one of the pedals squeaked if pressed too firmly. She had found it on an online marketplace, being given away by a family who just wanted it removed from their basement. The cost of moving it had eaten through her savings. But May had never regretted the expense. She set down her bag, kicked off her shoes, and went through her post-work ritual, washing her hands thoroughly, changing into comfortable clothes, drinking a glass of water. Only then did she approach the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing down. A silent greeting to an old friend. Taking a deep breath, May sat down on the bench and closed her eyes. For a moment she just sat there, letting the quiet of the room wash over her, the boundary between diner May and pianist May dissolving with each heartbeat. Then her fingers found their places and music filled the small apartment. The transformation was remarkable. The woman whose hands had spent all day carrying plates and writing orders now commanded sound with authority and sensitivity. Her fingers, released from their mundane duties, flew across the keyboard with precision and passion that would have astonished anyone who knew her only as the quiet waitress from the Bluebird. Tonight, she played one of her own compositions, a piece she'd been refining for months. It began softly, almost tentatively, like rain starting to fall, then built gradually towards something more complex and emotionally rich. The music spoke of longing and persistence, of dreams deferred but not abandoned. May lost track of time as she played, making minor adjustments to the composition, repeating passages until they felt right. The neighbors never complained about her playing. The walls were surprisingly thick for such an old building, and besides, she had made it a point to befriend the elderly couple next door by occasionally bringing them leftover pie from the diner. 2 hours passed before May finally stopped, her fingers hovering above the keys as the last notes faded. The piece was nearly finished now. It needed just a few more refinements, perhaps a stronger resolution at the end. She jotted down some notations in the well-worn music notebook she kept on top of the piano. Once this had been her planned future, studying piano at the prestigious Westridge Conservatory. She had even been accepted with a partial scholarship, an achievement that had filled her with pride and hope. But then life intervened in the form of a family crisis back home, and her savings had gone to medical bills rather than tuition. By the time things stabilized, the opportunity had passed, and practical concerns had taken precedence over musical ambitions. So now she played for herself alone, in this small apartment after long days of serving others. The irony wasn't lost on her, that her hands capable of creating such beauty spent most of their time carrying plates and wiping down tables. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother, thousands of miles away but still a daily presence in her life. May picked it up, smiling at the photo of her parents standing in front of their newly repaired roof, a repair made possible by the money she sent home each month. "Worth it," she whispered, touching the screen gently. Her sacrifice had purpose even if no one ever heard her music. She made herself a simple dinner, leftover rice and vegetables, and ate while watching tutorial videos from a famous pianist she admired. Even after all these years, she was still learning, still improving, though she had no audience but herself. Before bed, May checked her schedule for the next day, set her alarm and laid out her uniform. Tomorrow would be another long day at the diner, a double shift because Tina needed time off for a doctor's appointment. As she settled onto her futon, muscles aching from hours on her feet followed by hours at the piano, May wondered, as she often did, whether anyone would ever hear her music. Her grandmother had once told her that talent always finds its way into the light eventually. Like water finding cracks in stone, she had said in her native language, her aged hands demonstrating how even the smallest stream could eventually carve a path through solid rock. Patience and persistence. That is all you need. May wasn't so sure. Portland was full of talented people, musicians playing on street corners and in subway stations, artists selling their work at weekend markets, writers hunched over laptops in coffee shops. Talent alone wasn't enough in a world that valued practicality over passion. Still, she couldn't stop playing any more than she could stop breathing. The music was part of her now, running through her veins alongside her blood. Even during her busiest shifts at the diner, melodies played in her mind as she moved between tables. Her fingers sometimes tapped out rhythms on the edge of the counter when she thought no one was watching. As sleep began to claim her, May's thoughts drifted to the concert she had watched online last week, a renowned pianist playing to a packed hall. She had studied every movement, every nuance of interpretation, imagining herself on that stage instead of in her tiny apartment, not out of envy but as a way of keeping the possibility alive, however remote it might seem. Tomorrow would be just like today, taking orders, serving food, smiling through exhaustion. But tomorrow night, she would return to her piano and continue refining her composition, and maybe someday someone would hear it. Maybe someday her music would find its way into the light. For now, though she was just May, the reliable waitress at the Bluebird Diner, the music would remain her secret a little longer, waiting for its moment to be heard. Rain pounded against the windows of the Bluebird Diner, turning the evening streetlights into blurry halos. Inside, the usual Tuesday dinner crowd had swelled as people ducked in to escape the downpour. May moved efficiently between tables, her sneakers squeaking slightly on the black and white checkered floor. "Order for table 7, Frank called from behind the counter, sliding 2 plates of meatloaf special toward her. May balanced the plates on her arm and weaved through the maze of tables and customers. The small upright piano in the corner of the diner sat empty tonight. Usually old Charlie would be playing his repertoire of gentle jazz standards. Nothing fancy, just pleasant background music that had become part of the Bluebird's charm over the years. "Where's the piano guy?" asked a regular customer as May refilled his coffee cup. "Charlie called in sick," she explained. Something about his arthritis acting up in this weather. Frank appeared beside her, looking unusually stressed. "Just got off the phone with Charlie," he said, keeping his voice low. "His hands are so swollen he can barely hold the phone, let alone play. Says he won't make it for the rest of the week." May glanced at the empty piano, then at the growing crowd. Many Tuesday regulars came specifically for the live music. "I've called 3 people who sometimes fill in," Frank continued, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Nobody's available on such short notice. Guess we're going without music tonight." The disappointment in his voice was clear. The Bluebird wasn't just a job to Frank. It was his life's work, a neighborhood institution he'd inherited from his father and had run for over 20 years. May bit her lip, her heart suddenly pounding. A voice inside her whispered that this was a moment. One of those rare chances life occasionally offers when you least expect it. For 3 years, her music had remained locked in her apartment, heard by no one. "Frank," she said, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the diner. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Frank, I could play. Just for tonight," he stared at her. "You play piano?" She nodded, suddenly feeling like she might be sick. Why had she spoken up? "Well enough for the diner." Another nod, more confident this time. Frank looked at her with new eyes, as if suddenly seeing a person who had been invisible before. "You serious about this?" "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I can play." 5 minutes later, May found herself sitting at Charlie's piano, her apron still tied around her waist. The instrument was different from hers, a bit newer, with lighter action on the keys and a brighter tone. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the bench. A few customers had noticed her sitting there, curiosity on their faces. Frank stood nearby, watching with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Just the usual stuff Charlie plays is fine," he said. "Keep it simple, background music." May placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. She started with a familiar jazz standard, something safe that wouldn't draw too much attention. The notes flowed easily, muscle memory taking over despite her nervousness. After a few minutes, her shoulders relaxed slightly. This wasn't so different from playing at home, she told herself. Just focus on the music. As she finished the first song, a smattering of applause surprised her. She nodded slightly in acknowledgement, then moved into another familiar tune. By the third song, she felt brave enough to try one of Charlie's regular pieces, but with her own subtle variations. A slightly more complex chord here, an unexpected minor shift there. More people were watching now. The background music was becoming not so background anymore. Mee kept her eyes on the keys, afraid to meet anyone's gaze. This next piece would be the test. Instead of another jazz standard, she transitioned smoothly into one of her own compositions, the one she'd been perfecting in her apartment for months. The music started softly, almost tentatively. Her original piece had an unusual quality to it. Not quite classical, not quite jazz, but something in between that felt entirely her own. As her confidence grew, so did the music, building towards something richer and more complex than anything Charlie had ever played in the diner. The clatter of silverware against plates gradually diminished. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even Frank stood transfixed behind the counter, a coffee pot forgotten in his hand. In the corner booth, an older woman with silver-streaked hair sat alone, her dinner half-eaten and forgotten. Professor Lin had stopped at the Bluebird on a whim, seeking shelter from the rain and a quick meal before heading back to her office at the conservatory. Now, her trained ear recognized something extraordinary happening in this humble diner. The composition was original and compelling, sophisticated yet accessible, technically impressive without being showy. And the young woman playing it was wearing a waitress uniform. May lost herself in the music, forgetting where she was, forgetting her audience. Her fingers found the keys with precision and feeling, drawing out the melody that had lived so long in her head and heart. When the final notes faded, the silence that followed seemed to vibrate with something unspoken. Then came the applause, not the polite, distracted acknowledgement of background music, but the genuine, enthusiastic response to a true performance. May's cheeks flushed as she finally looked up to see the entire diner watching her, some customers even standing. "Play another one," someone called out. Frank appeared at her side, his expression a mixture of amazement and confusion. "Where did that come from?" he asked quietly. "That wasn't any song I've ever heard Charlie play." "It's something I wrote," May admitted, her voice barely audible. "You wrote that?" His eyebrows shot up. "You're telling me my waitress who's been working here for 3 years is some kind of musical genius?" "Not a genius," she said quickly. I love music. I always have." "Well, don't stop now," Frank said, gesturing to the still applauding customers. "Give them an encore." So she did. For the next hour, May alternated between familiar tunes and her own compositions, each original piece drawing more attention than the last. The rain continued outside, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. At one of the tables near the piano, a businessman who had only stopped in because of the storm found himself neglecting urgent emails on his phone, captivated by the unexpected music. At another, an elderly couple who had been coming to the Bluebird every Tuesday for a decade sat holding hands, their eyes closed as they listened, and in that corner booth, Professor Lin remained, her food now cold, watching with growing interest. As department chair at the Portland Conservatory of Music, she had heard countless pianists over the years, students, faculty, guest performers. What struck her about this young woman wasn't just her obvious technical skill, but the authentic emotion in her playing. There was a story behind those notes, a lifetime of feeling compressed into music. When May finally stopped, her hands aching pleasantly from the longest continuous performance she'd given in years, the diner erupted in applause again. Frank was beaming with pride as if he'd personally discovered her talent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the crowd, "seems like our May has been keeping secrets from us. Who knew we had a concert pianist serving our meatloaf special?" May blushed deeply, uncomfortable with the attention yet unable to deny the thrill of finally sharing her music with others. As the excitement settled and she rose from the piano bench, the silver-haired woman from the corner booth approached. There was something in her measured steps and assessing gaze that made May stand a little straighter. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice cultured but kind. "My name is Professor Lin. I teach at the Portland Conservatory of Music." She held out a business card. "That last piece on the one with the interesting bridge passage, when was that your composition?" May nodded, suddenly finding it hard to speak. "It's remarkable work," Professor Lin continued. "Tell me, have you had formal training?" "Some," May admitted. "I studied for years back home. I was accepted to Westridge Conservatory, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to delve into the family obligations and financial constraints that had derailed her plans. Understanding flickered in the professor's eyes. "Life happens," she said simply, "but talent like yours shouldn't remain hidden." She glanced around the diner, which was still buzzing with excitement about the performance. "The faculty showcase at the conservatory is in 3 weeks. We feature outstanding musicians from our community. Would you consider performing? Just one piece." May stared at the business card in her hand, hardly believing what she was hearing. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that." "Based on what I heard tonight, you're more than ready," Professor Lin said firmly. "Think about it. Call me either way." With a warm smile, she left a generous tip on her table and headed for the door. Frank appeared at May's side, still looking somewhat stunned. What did she want? "She's invited me to play at some showcase," May said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "Well, of course she did." "You're amazing." Frank clapped a hand on her shoulder. "Listen, how would you feel about adding some piano shifts to your schedule? Nothing crazy, maybe just Tuesday and Friday evenings to start. Charlie's hands aren't getting any younger, and the customers clearly love your playing." May looked at the piano, then at the card in her hand, then at the diner full of people who had just discovered something about her that she'd kept hidden for so long. "I'd like that," she said softly, a smile spreading across her face. For the first time in years, the path ahead seemed to bend toward possibility rather than obligation. Later that night, as she walked home under clearing skies, May felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her music had released something long held captive inside her. The rain had stopped and the streets glistened under the streetlights. She held Professor Lin's card carefully, like something fragile and precious. Tomorrow would still bring the usual challenges, bills to pay, family back home depending on her. But tonight something had changed. Tonight her secret talent had stepped into the light, and remarkably the world had welcomed it. Word about the piano-playing waitress spread through Portland like wildfire. What had begun as a rainy Tuesday night at the Bluebird Diner had transformed into something nobody could have predicted, least of all May herself. The morning after her impromptu performance, she arrived for her usual breakfast shift to find a small line already forming outside the diner. Frank greeted her with a grin wider than she'd ever seen on his normally gruff face. "You're a hit," he said, handing her an apron. "These people are here for you. For me?" May felt her stomach tighten. "But I'm just filling in on piano." "I'm still a waitress," Frank shook his head. "Not anymore. Well, not just a waitress. From now on, you're our waitress who plays piano. Look at this." He showed her a hastily made sign in the window. "Live piano performance by May, Tuesday and Friday evenings." Inside, the regular morning customers peppered her with questions and compliments as she poured their coffee. "I had no idea you were so talented." My wife couldn't believe it when I told her. "She's coming on Friday to hear you play." "Have you always been musical?" May answered politely but briefly, still uncomfortable with the attention. She had spent years blending into the background, doing her job quietly and saving her passion for the privacy of her apartment. Now suddenly, that invisible barrier between her two worlds had dissolved. During her break, she finally worked up the courage to call the number on Professor Lin's card. Her finger hovered over the last digit for several seconds before she finally pressed it. Portland Conservatory of Music. "Professor Lin speaking." "Hello?" May said, her voice smaller than she intended. "This is May from the diner last night." "May, I'm so glad you called." The professor's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "Have you thought about my offer?" May took a deep breath. "Yes, I'd like to play at the showcase. Just one piece, like you said." "Wonderful. I'll email you the details. We have a brief rehearsal the day before, but it's mainly to get comfortable with the space. The acoustics in our recital hall are quite different from a diner." After hanging up, May stared at her phone, a mixture of excitement and terror washing over her. What had she just committed to? Throughout the rest of her shift, she mentally sorted through her compositions, trying to decide which piece would be best for the showcase. The one she'd played at the diner was nearly finished, but could she perfect it in just 3 weeks? And when would she practice? Between her regular shifts and the new piano performances Frank had scheduled, her free time had suddenly become much scarcer. As the days passed, May settled into a new routine. She still worked her regular morning and afternoon shifts, but now Tuesdays and Fridays included evening piano performances. Frank had rearranged the diner's layout slightly, moving tables to create better sightlines to the piano. He'd even invested in a small sound system so she could be heard more clearly during busy times. The crowds grew steadily. Regular customers brought friends and family. Local food bloggers started showing up, posting videos of her playing that gathered thousands of views. A reporter from a neighborhood newspaper came to interview her, though May kept her answers modest and brief. "Still uncomfortable with being the center of attention. You should be charging for these performances," one customer told her after a particularly moving piece had drawn enthusiastic applause, but May shook her head. "I'm just glad people enjoy the music." The truth was, she was grateful to Frank for giving her this opportunity. He'd increased her hourly rate for the piano shifts and even adjusted her schedule so she could have more time to practice for the upcoming showcase. Each night after work, exhausted from her shifts, May would still sit at her apartment piano for hours, refining her showcase piece. She had decided on her most ambitious composition, a piece that began with delicate, almost fragile notes that gradually built toward something powerful and triumphant. It reflected her own journey, though she would never have described it that way to anyone else. 1 week before the showcase, Professor Lin stopped by the diner again. She sat quietly in a corner booth, listening as May played for the Friday night crowd. After the final set, she approached the piano. "Your technique is impressive," she said, "especially considering you're largely self-taught these past few years." May thanked her, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. But I wonder if you've considered what comes after the showcase, Professor Lin continued. Have you thought about formal training again? The conservatory has scholarship programs for exceptional talents. The question caught May off guard. She had been so focused on preparing for the showcase that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond it. I can't just leave my job, she said. I have responsibilities, bills to pay, family depending on me. Professor Lin nodded understanding. Many of our students work while studying. It's not easy, but it's possible. She pulled out another business card. This is our admissions counselor. Just talk to her, explore the options. No commitment. May took the card, doubt and longing battling inside her. That night she couldn't sleep. The idea of returning to her original dream of music education filled her with both hope and anxiety. Could she really balance work, study, and her obligations to family? Was it selfish to even consider it? She called her mother the next morning, fingers trembling slightly as she described the unexpected turns her life had taken in the past 2 weeks. The restaurant owner wants me to play piano regularly now, she explained, and this professor thinks I should consider music school again. There was a pause on the line and May braced herself for disappointment or worry. Her parents had always been practical people, concerned more with stability than passion. Your grandmother would be so proud, her mother said finally, her voice soft with emotion. She always said your music would find its way into the world someday. But what about the money I send home? May asked. If I'm studying, I might not be able to help as much. We are managing better now, her mother assured her. Your father's new medication is working, and my sister has moved in to help. You've carried us for years, daughter. Perhaps it's time to carry your own dreams for a while. Tears pricked at May's eyes as she hung up, feeling as though a weight had been partially lifted from her shoulders. Not completely. There were still practical concerns, financial realities. But the simple knowledge that her family supported her made everything seem more possible. The days before the showcase flew by in a blur of work shifts, piano practice and nervous anticipation. The diner had become busier than ever, with customers sometimes waiting 30 minutes for a table on the nights May played. Frank had hired 2 new waitresses to help manage the increased business, which relieved some of May's workload. Never seen anything like it, he told her, watching the full tables with satisfaction. You're the best thing that ever happened to this place. The night before the showcase, several of the diner's regular customers presented May with a small gift. A beautiful wooden metronome, engraved with her name and the date of her first performance at the Bluebird. We all chipped in, explained Mr. Roberts, the elderly man who came every morning for the same breakfast, for good luck tomorrow. May was so touched she could barely speak, just nodding her thanks as she carefully wrapped the metronome back in its box. The morning of the showcase arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp, clear, and full of possibility. May had the day off from the diner, but she couldn't sit still in her apartment. She practiced one final time, then changed into the simple but elegant black dress she'd purchased for the occasion. Her first new dress in years. As she locked her apartment door, a notification pinged on her phone. It was a good luck message from Frank, along with a photo of the diner staff holding a hand-painted sign, Bluebird Star, Knock 'em Dead. The conservatory's recital hall was nothing like the diner. No clinking dishes or coffee machine hum, just rows of seats facing a gleaming grand piano on a proper stage. During the brief rehearsal, May had felt overwhelmed by the space, the acoustics, the sheer formality of it all. But now, as she waited backstage with the other performers, a strange calm settled over her. Professor Lin found her there, sitting quietly while the other musicians chatted nervously among themselves. Your diner fans are here in force, the professor said with a smile. Quite a cheering section you have. May peeked through the curtain and saw them. Frank in an actual tie. The new waitresses, Mr. Roberts and at least a dozen other regular customers, all dressed in their Sunday best, sitting together in the middle section. I never expected any of this, May said softly. 3 weeks ago I was just a waitress. Professor Lin shook her head. No, 3 weeks ago you were already a pianist and composer. The world just didn't know it yet. She squeezed May's shoulder gently. Now they will. As May walked onto the stage 30 minutes later, the polite applause was punctuated by enthusiastic cheers from the Bluebird contingent. She smiled in their direction, then settled herself at the piano, adjusting the bench just so. For a moment, she thought of everything that had brought her here, the years of hidden practice, the family obligations, the chance rainy night when Charlie's arthritis had acted up, the long path from where she started to this stage. Then she placed her fingers on the keys and began to play her composition, no longer a secret kept in a small apartment, but a gift offered to the world. The applause following May's performance at the faculty showcase seemed to go on forever. She had played her heart out, pouring years of hidden passion into those minutes on stage. When she finally rose from the piano bench and took a bow, she caught sight of Professor Lin in the wings, nodding with unmistakable approval. Backstage, well-wishers surrounded her, fellow performers, music students, faculty members, all wanting to compliment her playing or ask about her compositions. The Bluebird contingent pushed through the crowd, Frank leading the way with a bouquet of flowers that must have cost him a day's profits. "You were amazing, kid," he said, thrusting the flowers into her hands. "I've never heard anything so beautiful in my life." Mr. Roberts patted her arm with tears in his eyes. "My late wife loved piano music. She would have adored your playing." Among the crowd was a tall man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Dean Walsh from the conservatory's administration. "Professor Lin has spoken highly of you," he said, handing her his card. "We should discuss your future. The spring semester application deadline is approaching, but exceptions can be made for exceptional talents." May nodded politely, feeling overwhelmed by the attention and possibilities suddenly opening before her. This evening had changed something fundamental. She was no longer just a waitress who played piano on the side. She was a pianist, a composer, someone whose talent deserved to be taken seriously. The following days brought a whirlwind of changes. A local arts reporter wrote a feature about her, complete with photographs of May both at the piano and in her waitress uniform. A small record label owner approached her about recording some of her compositions. The Bluebird's business boomed with lines forming outside before her performance nights. Frank, seeing opportunity, expanded her piano schedule to 4 nights a week. "People love you," he insisted when she expressed concern about the increased hours. "And the tips are better when you play, right?" It was true. Her income had nearly doubled since she started performing regularly. For the first time in years, May wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. She had even started researching scholarship opportunities at the conservatory, emboldened by her family's support and the dean's interest. But 3 weeks after the showcase, cracks began to appear in the seemingly perfect new life. It started with a slight stiffness in her hands one morning. May had been practicing late into the night after her diner shifts, working on new compositions while also revisiting classical pieces she would need to perfect if she returned to formal study. The mild discomfort didn't worry her. She'd experienced similar fatigue before during intensive practice periods. By the second week, however, the stiffness had evolved into a dull ache that lingered throughout her work shifts. Carrying heavy trays of food became increasingly uncomfortable. Still, she pushed through, not wanting to let down Frank or disappoint the customers who now came specifically to hear her play. "You look tired," Professor Lin commented during one of her now regular visits to the diner. The professor had become something of a mentor, offering guidance on everything from technique to conservatory applications. "Just busy," May replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's a good kind of busy." But it wasn't just physical exhaustion weighing on her. The newfound attention brought unexpected pressure. Customers who had once been satisfied with any music she played now made requests, sometimes expressing disappointment when she didn't know a particular piece. Online videos of her performances attracted comments both glowing and critical. Even Frank, despite his good intentions, had begun suggesting she learn more crowd-pleasing tunes to draw even bigger audiences. "People love that emotional stuff you write," he said. "But they also want some songs they recognize, you know?" At home, May's practice sessions became more fraught. Her fingers felt clumsy on pieces that should have been easy. The joy of playing, that pure, private pleasure she had cultivated for years, was increasingly overshadowed by expectations, deadlines, and a growing fear that she wasn't good enough after all. One particularly busy Thursday night, the diner was packed beyond capacity. A local blog had featured May that morning, bringing in curious newcomers on top of the regular crowd. She had been on her feet since the breakfast shift, running on too little sleep and too much coffee. As she cleared a table, balancing a precarious stack of plates, a sharp pain shot through her right wrist. The dishes clattered to the floor, shattering against the black and white tiles. The entire diner fell silent. "I'm sorry," May gasped, kneeling to gather the broken pieces. Her hands were trembling visibly now, the right one unable to fully close. "Leave it," Frank said, suddenly beside her. "Go take a break. I'll clean this up." In the cramped staff restroom, May ran cold water over her wrists, fighting back tears of pain and frustration. When she tried to flex her fingers, the right hand responded with another jolt of pain. Fear gripped her chest, not just for tonight's performance, but for everything she had begun to hope for. Without her hands, what was she? A gentle knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "May, it's Professor Lin. Frank asked me to check on you." When May emerged, the professor took one look at her cradled hand and shook her head. "You're overworking yourself. This can't continue." "I'm fine," May insisted weakly. "I have to play tonight. People are waiting." "Those people will still be here when you're healthy," Professor Lin said firmly. "I've seen too many promising musicians derail their careers by ignoring their physical limits." "Hands are not invincible, May." Frank appeared in the hallway, concern etched on his face. "Everything okay?" "No," Professor Lin answered before May could speak. "She needs to rest her hands." "No piano tonight." "But the customers," Frank began. "Will have to be disappointed," the professor finished, "unless you want your pianist to develop a repetitive strain. Injury that could end her playing for good." The word pianist hung in the air between them, not waitress, not employee, but pianist. A recognition of what mattered. Most Frank's expression softened. "Of course. Health comes first." He turned to May. "Go home. Rest. We'll manage." But as May gathered her things, the weight of disappointing an entire room of expectant people pressed on her chest. She had never called in sick, never failed to show up for a shift in all her years at the diner. And now, on one of the busiest nights, she was leaving early, abandoning her responsibilities. Outside, the cool evening air did little to calm her churning thoughts. Professor Lin insisted on driving her home, using the time to deliver a gentle but firm lecture on the importance of physical care for musicians. "You can't pour from an empty cup, May," she said as they reached the apartment building, "and you can't play with injured hands." Alone in her apartment, May sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the piano that had been her only true companion for so long. For the first time in years, she didn't play. Instead, she called her sister back home, desperate for a familiar voice. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, after explaining the situation. "Maybe I was foolish to think I could be a real musician at my age with my responsibilities." Her sister's response was both compassionate and challenging. "Remember when I broke my leg last year? You told me healing wasn't a waste of time. You said sometimes we have to slow down to eventually go further." "This is different," May protested, "is it? You've spent years taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to take care of yourself." The next morning, May awoke to several text messages, Frank checking if she was okay, Professor Lin providing the name of a hand specialist who worked with musicians, Mr. Roberts and other regulars from the diner sending well wishes. She had expected anger or disappointment. Instead, she found concern and support. The hand specialist confirmed what Professor Lin had suspected: the beginnings of tendinitis, brought on by overuse and exacerbated by stress. Not career-ending if addressed now, but a clear warning sign. Musicians push themselves too hard, the doctor said, demonstrating gentle stretches and exercises, especially the dedicated ones. You need to establish sustainable practices if you want a long career. A long career. The words echoed in May's mind as she left the clinic with a wrist brace and strict instructions to rest for at least a week. Back at her apartment, she found a note that had been slipped under her door. It was from Frank, his usually messy handwriting carefully controlled as if he had taken extra time with it. "Take all the time you need," it read. "Your health matters more than business. The diner was your beginning, not your end. When you're ready to return, as a waitress, as a pianist, or both, your place is waiting. We'll make changes, better scheduling, proper breaks. I should have seen you were struggling. I'm sorry." Sitting at her kitchen table with the afternoon sun slanting through the window, May finally allowed herself to cry. Not just for the pain in her hands or the fear for her future, but for the unexpected kindness she had found. For years she had carried her burdens alone, believing that was the only way. Now suddenly there were people willing to help carry them. The piano sat silent across the room, patient and waiting. She couldn't play today or tomorrow or even next week. But for the first time she believed there would be many tomorrows where she could play, not just as a waitress with a hidden talent, but as the musician she was always meant to be. She looked down at her hands, still beautiful despite their temporary weakness. These hands had served others for so long, carrying plates, pouring coffee, sending money home to family. Now they needed to be served themselves, to be strengthened and healed. Rest, she told them softly. We have music waiting for us. Spring came to Portland with a gentle persistence, coaxing flowers from reluctant soil and bringing longer, warmer days. For May, the changing season mirrored her own gradual renewal, a careful emergence from difficulty into something hopeful and unexpected. The weeks following her hand injury had been challenging. Physical therapy exercises consumed time she once would have spent practicing piano. The wrist braces felt clumsy and foreign, a constant reminder of how fragile her dreams could be. But slowly, steadily, her hands began to heal. During her recovery, May discovered parts of herself long neglected. She explored Portland's parks and gardens, something she'd never made time for during years of work and solitary practice. She read books about music theory and composition, feeding her mind while her hands rested. She reconnected with old friends through long phone calls, no longer too busy or too focused on survival to nurture these relationships. Most surprisingly, she found herself enjoying the stillness. After so many years of constant motion, rushing from apartment to diner, from customer to customer, from one piece of music to the next, the quiet became not an enemy but a teacher. Silence is part of music too, Professor Lin reminded her during their weekly coffee meetings. The spaces between notes matter as much as the notes themselves. Frank had been true to his word, holding her position at the diner while making it clear she could return on her own terms. The regular customers sent a handmade get-well card signed by dozens of people, many adding personal notes about how her music had brightened their days. 3 months after that painful night when her hands had finally rebelled, May sat in Dean Walsh's office at the conservatory, nervous but composed. Your application is impressive, he said, reviewing her file. Professor Lin speaks very highly of your talent, and the recordings you submitted demonstrate remarkable skill and creativity. Thank you, May replied simply. However, the dean continued, I understand you're still recovering from tendinitis. Music performance is physically demanding. Are you certain this is the right time to begin such an intensive program? It was the question May had been asking herself for weeks. The answer had come to her gradually, taking shape during long walks and quiet moments of reflection. I believe it is, she said with quiet confidence. My injury taught me something important. I've spent years playing in secret, then tried to make up for lost time by overworking myself. Now I understand that sustainable practice is better than frantic catching up. The dean smiled, seeming pleased with her answer. Professor Lin mentioned your wisdom. We'd like to offer you a place in our program. With a partial scholarship, you'd start in the fall semester, which gives your hands more time to fully recover. I'd also like to continue working part-time, May added. Not just for financial reasons, but because I've realized that playing for the diner customers brings me a kind of joy that's different from formal performance. I don't want to lose that. An unusual request for a conservatory student, Dean Walsh remarked, but not impossible to accommodate. Your schedule would be challenging. I'm used to challenges, May said, and I've learned to be smarter about how I handle them. 2 weeks later, on a perfect spring evening, the Bluebird Diner held a special event, the official return of their pianist. Frank had spent days promoting it, even printing actual tickets that quickly sold out. He'd rearranged the diner's layout again, creating a proper performance area around the piano and setting up more seats than tables for the evening. Professor Lin arrived early, bringing several faculty members and students from the conservatory. Mr. Roberts wore a freshly pressed suit and brought his grown daughter, who had heard so much about the amazing pianist at Dad's favorite diner. Local reporters positioned themselves discreetly in corners. When May emerged from the back room, the crowd broke into applause before she'd even reached the piano. She wore a simple blue dress rather than her waitress uniform, her hair styled differently than usual. The physical therapy had returned strength to her hands, and regular rest had erased the perpetual tiredness from her eyes. Frank silenced the room with a surprisingly emotional introduction. "Some of you have been coming to the Bluebird for decades, while others are here for the first time tonight. But we're all here for the same reason, to welcome back someone special." His voice cracked slightly. "When May first offered to fill in at the piano that rainy night, I had no idea what was about to happen. Neither did she, I think. But some talents are too big to stay hidden forever." As May settled at the piano, she took a moment to look around the diner, at the familiar checkerboard floor where she had dropped those plates months ago, at the counter, where she had taken thousands of orders over the years, at the faces of people who had transformed from customers into something closer to family. Her first piece was new, composed during her recovery. It was gentler than her previous works, but with an underlying strength that reflected her journey. As she played, she felt none of the desperate intensity that had characterized her performances before the injury. Instead, there was a steady joy, a communion between herself, the music, and the listeners. Between pieces, May spoke to the audience, something she'd never done before. She thanked them for their support, shared brief stories about what specific compositions meant to her, and even joked about how her first concern after dropping those plates had been whether they would be deducted from her paycheck. "Frank assured me they wouldn't be," she added with a smile, "though I noticed my Christmas bonus was a bit smaller last year." The audience laughed, and Frank called out, "That's not true!" from the back, his face glowing with pride. After the performance, as people lingered over dessert and coffee, May found herself the center of a different kind of attention than before. Not just praise for her playing, but genuine interest in her story and her future plans. "Will you still work here when you're studying at the conservatory?" asked a longtime customer. "Yes, but with a more sensible schedule," May replied. "2 evenings a week at most. Frank and I worked it out." Frank nodded beside her. "The Bluebird will always be May's home," he said, "even when she's selling out concert halls and making albums." Later that night, as the last customers departed and the staff cleaned up, Professor Lin lingered at the counter, watching May help wipe down tables despite not being on the clock. "Old habits," May explained with a shrug. "Besides, they're short-staffed tonight because of my performance." "You found an unusual balance," the professor observed. "Most musicians your age are singularly focused on their art, sometimes to the exclusion of everything else." "I tried that," May said, thinking of those frantic days before her injury. "It didn't work for me. I need both worlds, the music and the ordinary life. They feed each other." The next morning, May woke early, made herself tea, and sat at her piano, the same one that had been her secret companion for so long. Her practice routine now included proper warm-ups, scheduled breaks, and a timer to prevent overexertion. The exercises her physical therapist had taught her had become second nature, integrated into her daily life. As sunlight gradually filled her small apartment, May began working on a new composition, something that combined elements of classical structure with the warmth and accessibility she'd developed playing for diner audiences. The piece was evolving into a bridge between her two worlds. Her phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Ticket reservations already coming in for Friday." "You've created a monster." May smiled, set the phone aside, and returned to her music. Later, she would head to the diner for a lunch shift, not because she desperately needed the money anymore, but because she genuinely enjoyed the connections she'd formed there. In the afternoon, she had a meeting with Professor Lin to discuss fall semester preparations. The evening would bring more practice, but not too much, just enough to progress while respecting her body's limits. 6 months ago, she could never have imagined this life, student and professional, waitress and pianist both rather than either. The journey from hidden talent to public recognition had been neither straight nor easy. There had been joy and pain, opportunity and setback, moments of triumph and moments of doubt. Yet here she was, her two separate worlds finally integrated into one authentic life. When her composition reached a natural pause point, May stood and stretched, looking out her window at the city below. People hurried to jobs, walked dogs, carried groceries, ordinary lives containing who knew what hidden talents and unspoken dreams. She thought of all the customers she'd served over the years, never guessing what currents ran beneath their everyday conversations. How many others like her were out there, with gifts waiting to be discovered? A group of music students passed on the sidewalk below, instrument cases slung over their shoulders. In the fall, she would be one of them, walking those same paths between classes. The thought no longer filled her with anxiety, but with a quiet determination. She belonged in both worlds now. May closed the piano gently and prepared for her shift at the diner. Tonight, she would return to this keyboard, this private space where her music had been born and nurtured through difficult years. But this afternoon belonged to the Bluebird, to Frank and the regulars, to the part of her life that kept her grounded and connected. As she reached for her coat, her phone rang, an unknown number. "Is this Mei Lin?" asked an unfamiliar voice. "This is Valley Public Radio. We heard your story and your recent performance. We'd like to feature you on our local artists program." May smiled as she answered, ready for whatever came next. Her music, once hidden away, now belonged to the world, and she was finally ready to share it.